Well, hey there, sport. Looks like your players are in a bit of a pickle.
Yeah, I think I made this encounter too hard.
Well, why'd you go and do that?
Because I wanted my last few encounters to be tougher, but they breezed through them.
Well, champ, want a few tips on how to balance encounters ahead of time and maybe even balance them mid-combat?
Golly gee, mister, that sounds great!
It sure does. Well, the first thing we need to talk about is challenge rating and encounter difficulty.
Say, I know what challenge rating is. It's the level of the monster.
Sure, just go ahead and interrupt me. Yes, challenge rating is essentially the level of the monster and determines how many experience points that monster is worth.
But what's an encounter difficulty?
Uh-huh. Why, it's all this malarkey. Party level, total monster XP value, ways to rate encounters from easy to deadly by just, calculating, by using the encounter builder on D&D Beyond. Theoretically, depending on the average level of your players, in an encounter they can handle a certain amount of XP worth of enemies in a single battle. If you have 4 players, each at level 5, and 2,000 experience worth of monsters, that's 500 experience points per player. That would be a medium difficulty encounter.
Wow, I get it now. I guess that's all I needed to know.
Sit down! You don't know crap, you little... See, encounter difficulty is a little more complicated than that. Let's take a look at those 4 level 5 adventurers and put them against an assassin.
Oh gosh, that rates as a hard encounter.
It is, except it probably isn't. Because that 5th level wizard just hit the assassin with a chromatic orb for 26 damage.
Uh-oh, that's 1/3 of the assassin's health. But he can do so much damage, so once it's his turn...
Sorry, but the monk just hit the assassin for another 8 damage and decided to use Stunning Strike. Your assassin's going to lose his turn and the players will have advantage when attacking him.
But that means he gets attacked like 4 more times with advantage and...
Your hard encounter is now a cakewalk. All because you forgot about the most important part of encounter difficulty, the action economy.
Well, how could I forget? I don't even remember reading about that in the books.
You only learn about the action economy after spending some time on the mean streets of DM Town, kiddo. In this case, action economy refers to the number of actions the party has versus the number the enemy has. If there's a drastic disparity in the number of actions between the two sides, that encounter difficulty isn't going to mean bupkis. Looks like that assassin needs a few CR1 lackeys or maybe a legendary action or resistance.
But assassins don't have that.
They're your baddies. They can have whatever the hell you want them to. At the very least, I say make sure your enemies have at least half as many actions as the party does. And even that can depend on the enemy's resistances, abilities, and all that.
That sounds confusing. If I have more players, can't I just pick a monster that's just a few CR levels higher than what the encounter difficulty says is deadly if I want a good solo boss?
Sometimes that can work, but you run the risk of the big solo monster needing just a little luck to hit so hard they start one-shotting your players, since those higher CR monsters are dealing damage meant for higher level players. Better to have more actions where you can spread out the damage than larger bursts of damage like that.
Golly! So my enemies need enough actions. That also means I shouldn't send too many small enemies at my players, I suppose, or I'll have the opposite problem.
Really think you know everything, don't you? Well, at first, absolutely. As your party gets to a higher level, they'll have a lot more resources to handle groups of enemies. Looking at you, casters. Whereas low-level parties might have a spell or two, but can easily get overwhelmed or just run out of useful abilities if the battle goes on too long. Once again, when it comes to large groups of enemies, you'll really need to take into account player and enemy abilities when you plan this. For instance, a group of 4 level 5 players would consider 14 CR 1/2 creatures hard. Now, if those creatures were gnolls, yeah, that would definitely be hard, but not impossible. If those 14 creatures were shadows in a dark building and your players didn't have any magic weapons, the chances of them surviving up to 14 strength drain attacks every round isn't great. The fact is, as a DM, you need to know both what your players and your monsters are capable of, not just challenge ratings, and utilize that information in ways where you can present monsters that will be difficult, but also not overwhelming.
Gee, mister, all that's well and good, but it's an awful lot to learn. What if I'm trying to make an encounter really challenging, but halfway through my players are doing the jitterbug all over it?
What the hell are you... Oh, it's too easy. Well, when it comes to balancing encounters mid-combat, there are a few options. First, when you're making encounters that are supposed to be challenging, include what I like to call Desperation Reactions. These are reactions that you can only use if the party is steamrolling an encounter. It might be reinforcements arriving after half the enemies are killed. It might be a boss getting a sudden reaction attack to everyone within range upon hitting half health. It might be a boss suddenly powering up with new, more dangerous abilities, or just gaining an extra attack on his turns, depending on how the battle is going. You can make just one of these desperation reactions per encounter, or set a few in place. For instance, you could have at half health your BBEG gets a special attack, and at a quarter health he panics and summons a demon to help him, even though it might try to kill him after. But once again, only pull on this emergency ripcord if you need to in order to keep the battle interesting. If the heroes have barely been scraping by the entire encounter, it isn't exactly desperate for the enemy. So, no desperation reaction. I recommend you make these reactions ahead of time and make sure there are still rules they adhere to. Otherwise, you're just going to panic make stuff up, and that doesn't feel as fair.
Wow, those desperation reactions sound pretty powerful.
No duh, dingus! That's why I only use them if the party is doing too well and I want to keep the battle interesting. It tends to be more fun than just secretly giving the enemy more health, or fudging some dice rolls in my favor, which can be fine in a pinch, but I prefer to avoid that.
Spiffy! What else?
What?
You said there are multiple options if the players are completely steamrolling an encounter, so what else can I do if that's happening?
That's easy. Let 'em! Every so often, it's fun for your players to encounter some big bad giant, have the monks stunlock him, and everyone beat him to a pulp without letting him get a single hit in. It doesn't hurt to sometimes let your party of heroes actually feel like heroes. Granted, you don't want that every battle, but sometimes just roll with it.
Huh, I suppose you're right. But what about if I accidentally made an encounter too difficult and it looks like I'm going to win?
The easy answer is have something happen that saves your party at the last moment. Unfortunately, this often isn't very satisfying, and your players will usually see through the ruse. An alternative is, whenever possible, have the monsters or bad guys capture the players instead, keeping them alive for some other purpose. The bad guys may want to ransom them, get information, or some such thing. And a monster may be saving them for a late-night snack. Or maybe is under the control of an evil wizard.
Huh, awesome! Now, what about if I want to beat them? Really wipe out the group?
Why, then you're a bad DM! Seriously, I'm kind of surprised at the number of times I've seen this question asked in online D&D groups. I imagine there are few scenarios in which you, as a DM, should want to actively wipe the party. It is literally the easiest thing to do. Have them fight 50 cockatrice and shadows, or a lich with an AC of 30, or some kind of double Tarrasque. Beating your players requires literally no skill. Unless you're playing some game in which the players want you to try and beat them, but you're restricted in, what you're allowed to throw at them in some ways based on some rules you've developed. That actually sounds pretty swell. But in most games, it requires no skill to kill the party. You're the DM, not the bad guy. It isn't you versus them.
Wow, you got really mad for a second, mister.
Holy damn it, Christmas! Are you still here?
Yeah?
Well, okie dokie then, slugger. That was a bit of a weird tangent, but too many folks seem to think of the DM as the player's enemy. Yeah, you control their enemies, but you also control their allies and the good parts of the campaign. You're taking them through a story, and most good stories don't have the intrepid heroes being killed halfway through by an overwhelming number of trolls. Sometimes heroes struggle, sometimes heroes kick hiney, and at the worst of times, they lose an ally. That's why we try to balance encounters. We don't want to make them so hard that they can't prevail, but we don't want them so easy that it feels like there's no threat of death if they aren't at least somewhat careful. To be able to balance encounters in this way takes time and practice, but if you follow the tips I've given you in this video, hopefully it will take a lot less of both. So, do you remember what we learned? Use challenge rating and encounter difficulty as a baseline while making sure there isn't too big a difference in the number of actions between players and bad guys. Don't just use harder monsters to make up for that either. Know player and monster abilities, and if you need to, make up special reactions to give the enemies a boost when needed. Also, think of alternative things the enemies might want to do other than just killing them. Finally, feel free to just give up and let your players stomp all over whatever you spent hours creating for them because they'll have fun. Is that right, mister? Sure, why not? Now get the hell out of here, you little scamp.
I don't know how. I think I'm just a disembodied voice. Am I even real?
Nope. Soon the video will be over, and we'll stop existing, only to be reborn over and over, just to relive this exact interaction. Even what I'm saying right now. We're even voiced by the same person, so I'm really just talking to myself. I'm not sure why I put this in the video, but we should probably just end it before the existential crisis sets in. I don't know why I made this video like this. Please like and subscribe. Bye-bye.